There is now a way to contact the Wolf Connection podcast. Send us an email to podcast@wolfconnection.org with your comments, questions, and guest ideas for Stephen and myself. You may hear your question answered on an upcoming podcast. Thank you for your support, and howls to you all. Welcome to the Wolf Connection podcast. I'm your host, Jon T. Let's talk about some wolves. Joining us from the University of Notre Dame, he is a professor of history there, and he's been there for 17 years, since 2004. We'll be speaking about one of his books today, but he's written 3 books. Here Lies Hugh Glass, A Mountain, a Bear, and the Rise of the American Nation, Nature Shock, Getting Lost in America, and the one that we'll be touching on today, Vicious, Wolves and Men in America. Professor Jon T. Coleman. Professor Jon, it's great to meet you. Thank you for taking the invitation. How are you doing today, sir?
Thank you for being here.
I'm doing great. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, absolutely. I got this, when I sent you the email, we got the recommendation for your book from Mark Cook, who is with Wolves of the Rockies. And when I was sick a couple of weeks ago, I thought this is the perfect time. Let me reach out to you, see if you're available. You were. And I immediately got your book. And it's an engrossing read for me. And it's different, where a lot of these wolf books that I've read, I can really sort of fly through. Whereas your book, I feel like I want to take time and go through each page and really understand everything that you're trying to get across. So it's a different read for me, which I enjoy. It's not just a go through. So just give everyone a little bit of a background about how you got involved in teaching and where you started to, I guess, cross the streams between writing and your educational background.
Oh, yeah, sure. Well, I grew up in Boulder, Colorado, and I went to the University of Colorado for my undergrad and a master's degree. And it was at Colorado that I met Patty Limerick, who was a very famous historian of the American West. And at that time, she was in the middle of kind of this movement in history called the New Western History, which was trying to reconsider the region and tell the history of the region in a different way. And one of the big focuses of the New Western History was environmental history. So thinking about the West as defined by its aridity or its mountains or the large presence of the federal government, or large Native American reservations, which made the region's history unique. And it was a very exciting time to be doing history and thinking about the region. And I was just really interested in the place I grew up, which didn't seem particularly historical to me when I was going to school and playing football and things that didn't have much to do with academics. So that kind of laid the groundwork for thinking about nature and the region. And then I went to Yale to do my PhD, and I was fishing around for a topic that not only might relate to Western American history, but also crossed over into early American history. And initially I was interested in dogs because it's the only domesticated species that Native Americans and colonists had in common. And I just kept running across references to wolves. And I just got more and more interested in them and really amazed by the kind of history that they revealed, which was both an environmental history, a history of nature, but also a history of, kind of a social history of people on the ground who owned livestock and were in conflict with wolves, but also these amazing stories that followed this particular species around. So it was a way to blend environmental, social, and cultural history.
And I know we're talking about wolves, but just on a personal note, I would love to know what made you start writing about mountain men as well?
Well, I read Frederick Manfred's novel about Hugh Glass years ago. So I was interested in that story, and I thought that it would be I wanted to continue writing about animals, but I wanted to do something a little bit different. And I was fascinated by this guy who got famous by nearly being eaten by a grizzly bear. Fascinating story to try to learn more about him and grizzly bears and the world that they move through.
So when you look back on when you grew up in Colorado and went to college in Colorado, did you feel that later on, as you're getting through your education and you're starting to write, did you recall any personal encounters or stories from your childhood or from your upbringing that sort of bled into that? Or was this just a whole new aspect of your education and getting into being an author? Was there anything you pulled from your childhood in starting to write these books?
Well, I grew up in the 70s and the 70s in Boulder. I mean, Boulder's always an interesting place, but it was a lot more funky even back then. We were outside going on hikes and being in the outdoors quite a bit. I mean, I can't trace back to like a particular animal story. I don't have anything that interesting, but sure, it certainly gave me an identity. And I just crossed the line where I've been living in the Midwest for longer than I lived in the West, and that's been kind of hard for me because I always considered myself a Westerner, so it very much colored my outlook on history. And also when you go to the East Coast, I felt a little bit out of place, and I certainly wasn't used to the landscape. I really like big open, big skies, which you can't get in New England or South Bend for that matter.
Yeah, I feel that it's a completely different beast. I'm originally from New York and Long Island, so there weren't a lot of those big wide open spaces. And moving to California, where there's a ton of big wide open spaces, and visiting Yellowstone and just seeing these mountain ranges and these plains just go on and on. It's a really different outlook on nature and the worldview in general, I think. So when you start to write Vicious, and you touched on it just a little bit just a few minutes ago, what were some of the things that, because I haven't finished it yet, but I'm halfway through, and I feel like I have a pretty good grasp of what you're conveying and what we're talking about. What were some of the, I guess, the myths and the legends, because we've gone through this a couple times on the podcast, that early European settlers who are coming from Europe and settling here in North America, what are the tales and the stories that they're taking with them across the ocean, coming here and bringing with them to interact when they first see these predators on the landscape and they see the natives on the landscape? Because you preface that as well, where they see natives for the first time, and there's a communication gap, obviously. There's just a lot of yelling and screaming. It's a lot of noise and whoops and hollers back and forth. It's bows and arrows going back and forth. I believe there was some cannon fire. So it seems like it's violent right off the start. So just preface, I guess, what those early years were and why it was so combative right from the get-go.
Right. Well, I mean, Europeans had I mainly focus on the English, but, they had access to all different kinds of folklore, and there's, wolf stories and associations and language that are embedded in England and other places. Famous stories about things like people thought that wolves only had one vertebrae in their backbone, so they couldn't turn around. You could drown them by holding their tail. There's all kinds of, there's obviously like the Red Riding Hood type stories, but there's also stories of werewolves, people turning into wolves. Wolves were sometimes associated with magical places. And so there were, there's certainly scary stories, but there are also magical stories. I mean, there was an array of associations that they could have drawn on. I guess what was so interesting to me is in the colonial context, you just don't see a lot of those stories. I for example, and this is history always comes to you in fragments. So who knows if some of this was actually there, but I didn't find any stories about werewolves. I didn't find any stories about wolves as being magical. I did find folklore stories about people being surrounded by wolves. Not any really about being harmed by them. A lot of the stories were associated wolves with crime. So at least in the English context, especially in New England, wolves were seen, they'd use adjectives like skulking, that they were robbers, and certainly the way that they treated them suggests that they saw them as criminals more than mortal threats. I don't think that they were afraid for their lives. Another surprising thing is just, it just started right away. That these conflicts with wolves, colonists met them on the beach, met them within, the first few months of being there. They were an immediate threat to their livestock. So some of the earliest laws that were passed in different colonies were wolf bounty laws. So it wasn't like they had a slow introduction, or this is something that only happened as people moved deeper into the forest or different areas. Wolves were right there, and they were on the forefront of people's minds.
Yeah, this makes me wonder. So over a few centuries, livestock owners and wolves have been at odds. It's been a really long time. And centuries later, wolves are back, totally new science, but still the same conflict. Based on what you were researching, why do you think that is? Like, what was happening then that maybe we can pull from to solve this, or does it just seem unsolvable at this point?
Well, I mean, it's quite a puzzle. And, as a historian, I mean, one of the ideas that I'm dedicated to is a notion of contingency, right? That things change over time. And that we have to be very careful about paying attention to context as we try to understand different phenomenon. But the puzzle of wolf hating is that it's so continuous, right? So the puzzle really is that continuity without, so for me, it's like, well, how do you have both of those things happening at the same time? How can you believe in contingency, but also explain continuity? And I think what you see is as you trace this history through different decades and different places, is that these same kind of elements keep reappearing, even if in a little bit different form, right? And one of the through lines is, especially in the United States, and especially when it comes to Euro-Americans, is the presence of livestock. That this is a huge source of the conflict. But I would go beyond that the presence of livestock creates the conflict. But in each of these contexts, that conflict gets put into a relationship with different kinds of stories, different kinds of political situations. And a lot of this has to do with, it's scapegoating. Wolves become a potent symbol for all different kinds of relationships. And it's often related with vulnerability. And especially up until the early 20th century, it was often related to community. Wolves were a very attractive symbol for kind of a community, right? That the pack seemed to be what fascinated people. So if you were in a conflict with somebody else, with another community, if you called them wolves, it carried a lot of meaning. And I think all these different things kind of get different associations get intertwined with one another, and they fuel one another, right? So you have this conflict kind of on the ground between livestock owners and predators, but you also have all these different stories being told about them, different people calling each other wolves, different people engaging in kind of these symbolic, violent actions against wolves. So, conflicts that don't have anything to do with wolves could come back to them in some form. And yeah, I know I'm being a little bit abstract, but I'll just ground it in what I think is kind of the central puzzle, which is, these livestock owners, I think it's understandable that they would have this conflict, but what's less understandable to me is why they would capture wolves alive and torture them. Why, so a lot of the wolf hunting in early America was done with pits. So the hunters would dig these pit traps, and they did that on purpose because they wanted to capture wolves alive in order to put them to death themselves. So, there's multiple instances of this. And to me, that just doesn't have a whole lot to do with just controlling wolves for livestock. There's something deeper was going on there. And I think it's this kind of the depth of the animosity and how it kind of spread out into these other parts of people's lives, which explain the longevity and intensity of wolf hatred.
Yeah, I agree with you. I think it's the first 5 pages, and it almost brought me to tears in the fact that it was so, not to be cliche, but it really was very vicious, because you really detail a lot of what you just said there, where it's a torture aspect, and it's a lot of the times, and we know this from from science, from people studying wolves now for decades, is that they want to not interact with human beings. They want to get away. They usually keep their distance for the most part. And when you read about these encounters of, you chronicle a few things. They cut the wolves' hamstrings so they can't run. So it's just a limp body that's there, that's being tortured by either human or dog. And the wolves themselves are, the ears are back and they're cowering and they're whimpering. And what does it say to you, or what does it speak to you in your research, that there's this almost innate feeling of hate or of fear that turns into anger and hate that is just put out through torturing or putting that on a certain species like the wolf? And then it branches out to grizzly bears, and it branched out. I mean, I read there was a story, I believe a quarter of the way through the book, where they would just have wolf hunts, but they would kill everything and anything that was in their path. It was deer, it was rabbits, it was fox. It really kind of didn't matter. So what speaks to the mental aspect of why this was such a camaraderie type thing that these individuals and these groups of people would do as a community activity almost?
Yeah, I mean, that's a hard thing to get your own head into their heads. It's not a comfortable place to be. I think it is often, like I said before, I think it comes out of a sense of vulnerability, in that these kind of killings are often associated with people who feel that they're besieged. In some ways, I think a lot of these community hunts that you referred to often have this kind of ritualized overturning of the natural order, right? It's almost like that people feel that nature is abusing them way, and it's not. Some of these people were not wealthy, and they lived a pretty hard scrabble existence. in existence that that we contemporary people, it's hard for us to imagine. If you're dependent on a crop, or if you are if you have a herd of cows or pigs that you want your children to inherit, it carries a lot of hope, and this is people planning for the future. So I think that that killing a wolf could be a very powerful kind of ritualistic exorcism of nature, maybe some of them. And I think it has a lot to do with masculinity. I don't think it's just but it's. You think it comes back to this notion of that there's some kind of power gained through it, and like you said, I mean, and the most striking thing to me is that in these moments that you can see in the archive, right? You can see in the documents that wolves are not, they're cowering in front of them, and you can read the behavioral studies and say, oh my God, they're trying to signal something, and it's not ferocity. I mean, they are not nature at these farmers' throat at that moment.
What was the average relationship with groups of natives and wolves? And how can we sort of justify why the mentality of Native Americans was so drastically different from that of Europeans, in the context of wolves?
Well, I think they lived with them, they saw them, and I also think that you have to. I mean, there are a range of relationships. I mean, I think it would be much different if you were kind of a northern tribe that relied exclusively on hunting. I think that you would have. I think that there was a much closer kind of identification with wolves as a fellow hunter, as opposed if you were growing maize in different parts of North America. I think it boils down to livestock to a large degree, but it's also the place of livestock within the project of colonization, because Native Americans adopted livestock pretty quickly as well in the Southwest with sheep, and even in New England you have groups adopting pigs within the first few decades of colonization. But livestock, they were agents of colonization. I mean, early settlement, it's not like they put these animals in a pen and looked after them. They just let them run loose. And this wasn't, they might have imagined the spaces that they were in as the wilderness, but it was somebody else's home. And eventually the pigs and the cattle and would roam into Native American fields and would have a conflict. So that's how all these conflicts with Native Americans, conflicts with wolves, get wrapped into one pretty quickly. So I would say that's the main difference, is that it's domestic animals, but it's domestic animals' role in settlement.
Yeah. And I think too, what I found interesting about your book, the teaching that you have in the book and the writing here, is that while there was this animosity between settlers and natives, they ended up almost trying to employ in some fashion natives and giving them bounties so that they probably had a better track record of tracking wolves and predators and saying, oh, we'll give you whatever the payment is for hunting and killing wolves to help us out. And of course, there was obviously nothing was ever truthful, or nothing was ever as straightforward as it is, as in most things. They would go and bring the wolf, and they'd have to prove that it was a wolf that was killed on a depredation or whatever the deal was. So it was, and the Native Americans, I think, figured that out fairly quickly, that we're kind of getting duped in a way. So it's fascinating to me that they went from adversaries to, I guess, trying to use the locals, quote unquote, to help them with their problem and try and have their own home exterminators.
Yeah, well, there were experiments in trying to kind of use wolf bounties as a way to civilize Native Americans. In colonial Virginia, for example, they had a law where they said if Indians brought in wolf heads, proof that they killed a wolf, that they would get a cow in return. And the idea was that taking care of the cow would civilize the native. So yeah, all these things, they ran together. It was not like they dealing with people and dealing with animals were separate issues. They didn't work. The fantasy of, and you can see how these native groups would figure out pretty quickly that what a wolf head meant to the colonists, right? It wasn't. It meant it was a symbol of power, and they were trying to get the natives to bring them in as a symbol of their own kind of subservience to them. There were a number of treaties that stipulated that different groups had to bring in wolf bounty scalps and heads to prove their fealty. So I think that explains to a large degree why groups didn't participate.
That's wild. So now there are these two poles. One group of people who sees wolves as a spiritual symbol to be protected at all costs. It's part of their identity, even though they're not necessarily seeing wolves on a regular basis. And then there's these same groups as in the past that equally want to see them gone. So was there an equivalent to that, to the first group I mentioned, sort of opposing this primary approach to wolves?
I didn't find them. That's another kind of striking feature, at least of the kind of story that I followed, which is kind of this settlement of New England and kind of the expansion of New England into the Midwest and then to places like Utah, and later switch over to the federal government being in charge of wolf eradication. Basically, until the late 19th century, early 20th century, I don't see a lot of ambiguity or split opinions about wolves. It's a unanimous cultural. I mean, like I said, it's striking because these are groups of people that they had other ways to think about these animals. They just didn't do it in this setting.
Yeah, it's really you're right. Striking is a great way to say, because you don't think about an entire, at that point in our history, there's really only one populace. And so that populace coming from really the same place, and I would imagine you're getting fed the same stories, the same legends, this is how we deal with this. If a wolf comes anywhere near your livestock, we're going to go on a hunt. We're going to do this, that, as we expand. And that's what it seemed like too, at least to where I'm at in your book, is it's more where I'm getting to the expansion part where they were growing out of New England. They're moving a little bit towards the Midwest. And it's really just about wanting land. And we need land for farming. We need land for livestock. And it really just disregards the natural landscape as it sits. And it's more about just, as you said, with the wolf heads, it's power. It's, we can rule over this. Yeah, we can rule over this indigenous culture. We can rule over these indigenous species and sort of do whatever we want in that vein.
Yeah, I'd say so. And that kind of crosses over this line between kind of the utilitarian or pragmatic notion of I got to protect these animals that I own. I'm protecting property to the symbolism of, well, how do we know that we own or control this space? And I think killing wolves is a way to answer that question, right? Once the wolves are eradicated, so quote unquote, this place is settled, which means that it's ours and not us. Someone else's.
Yeah. What's it like writing a book that has to be historically accurate? What was your process in the context of, I don't know, navigating truth and fiction? You must come across a plethora of what could be either when researching history.
Yeah, it's always it's always a matter of interpretation. You do your best to get multiple sources on something. You do your best to do due diligence and getting information around a source, and you look for patterns. If something doesn't fit a pattern that you see, you need to explain it. With wolves, with wolves, it's pretty clear when someone is telling a folk tale. they have their beats. It becomes its own genre, as opposed to like someone describing an actual encounter with them. In some ways, the sources were pretty honest in the. For example, I did not run across a single source of someone getting injured or killed by a wolf. And I fully expected to find, one or two. It's not out of the realm of possibility. And you would know that this would be a group of people that were almost eager to have that experience, but they didn't. And is you think about just people's interactions with other animals. The domestic dogs were much more dangerous. Bears were much more dangerous. Bees were much more dangerous.
Still that way.
It's a pretty remarkable track record to such an extent that I could imagine someone reading the book and saying, "Oh, this is." Book has a particular slant, but if I found it, I would have shared it and tried that.
Yeah, absolutely. And you also display, to your point just now, there are a couple of, and these seem like the tale portion or the folklore portion of it, where they describe not necessarily Little Red Riding Hood, but it's, that this person got lost in the woods trying to go from one tent to the other, and they were surrounded by this pack of wolves and he was never seen again, or they had this encounter and it was a scary situation, but it never led to this woman or this man or this child getting dismembered by this pack of wolves. But it was always like you would hear in the horror stories, it's in the deep dark woods, there's no light, I'm here with my horse, I hear the howls, then the leaves are rustling, and then all of a sudden there's a pack of wolves in there somewhere, 10, 20 wolves. And I think there were 3 or so that I remember pretty distinctly that, littered throughout at least the first half of the book where I'm in. And you're right. It's fascinating that you would say that. And it's interesting because you would think, like you said, at some point with no one really knowing any better, it's almost like you would think it would just happen, that there would be some sort of an accidental killing or something. And there wasn't any violence from nature's end, at least on the wolf side. I can't speak to bears, and bears are a lot more like you said, bears are a lot more dangerous. They will go after humans. So it's fascinating to me that's it's a different beast. That you're right, that it didn't exist, and yet it just perpetuated this myth and legend and folklore throughout hundreds of years.
Yeah, it's the near escape was enough. In a way, it seemed like they didn't need to get attacked by wolves to fuel how they understood it.
Right. Yeah, it was just the mere thought of it. So where do you see in your research and and I haven't finished, but I'm sure you've documented this and you've read about it. So really we're looking at the uh, where does the sentiment change? Because you said early 20th century, obviously wolves are mostly eradicated from the lower 48 states. Nothing in Alaska, obviously. I mean, they're in Alaska and the Yukon and things of that sort. But where do you see in your learning and your teaching that it starts to shift? That, like Steven said, we had this one populist idea where everyone just wolves are bad, they're evil, they're awful. Where does that start to shift? That there is actually a side that likes wolves and a side that doesn't like them.
Right. Well, I think it's part of a larger story of just changes in U.S. society as you move from kind of a rural society to mostly an urban one, and it just changes people's daily lives. So that's part of it, and that's that switch over is early 20th century. The demographic tipping point for rural tips. I think on top of that is wolf eradication became the federal government's job, and I think that was critically important. And this is part of conservation history. This notion that experts should be in charge of maximizing natural resources that humans can utilize and eradicating we call them resources, but vermin and different animals and pests that threaten commodities. So this is, there's a lot of backlash to bounties. Bounties were always, and bounty hunters had a really terrible reputation of fraud, taking wolf skins to multiple places to get multiple bounties. I mean, it was really expensive in places like Montana that were paying these wolf bounties. And there were stories of people, of hunters leaving dens, leaving puppies alive so that they could come back in other years and harvest them and kind of grow wolves for the bounties. So you had this movement where the federal government really teamed up with different livestock associations in different states. And the one I know best is Colorado, where there was a partnership between the federal government and the Wool Growers Association and the Cattle Growers Association that hired professional hunters, mainly using poison to exterminate wolves. And out of this, oddly, is you get a bunch of kind of folkloric stories about last wolves. And one of the guys who was in charge of the federal effort to exterminate wolves, Stanley Young, wrote this book, The Last Stand of the Pack, which described Three Toes and Bigfoot and Uniweep Wolf, and kind of painted them as both, they were doomed because they couldn't live in a agricultural landscape, but they were kind of grudgingly admired, right? So the professional killers, and this is kind of, this is a frontier type trope that you see in Westerns and other places, which is, the hunters and their prey are doomed. Once the last wolf is killed, what do you need? Why do you need a professional hunter? So they both go off into this closing frontier, and the emotion that elicits is kind of nostalgia. So I think that those ingredients, that were just flowing around in the culture, right? And there's fewer and fewer people killing wolves or interacting with wolves themselves. And then there's these stories that start floating around, which have this nostalgia attached to them. And even more important, wolves get names. And before this, in American history, I didn't find any wolves with names. They were always a pack. They were always a group. They were always a multitude. And these famous laugh wolves kind of shifted that. So I didn't want to tell a story of enlightenment, like it was somehow it flipped in somebody's mind. I think it has more to do with the changing context, and it also has to do with ecological thinking. Aldo Leopold and his famous story of fire dying in the wolf's eye, probably the classic expression of thinking about, well, maybe wolves do have a place in an environment. So all of that comes together to create kind of a split opinion, where there's lots of people that still despise wolves, and there's a group of people that love them, and then there's a group of people that don't think about them much. So it's definitely different. This is not the same as it's always been.
Yeah. Do you see any similarities or any behaviors or any sort of legislation that's going on now in these Western United States that is reverting back to the things that you learned about and wrote about in Vicious? Or do you think this is a blip sort of a thing? Or why do you think certain parts of our human nature is reverting back to these types of hunting, trapping, killing teachings and things in regards to wolves?
Yeah, I mean, I'm always predicting the future is always history isn't super helpful there. But I would say, some of the laws that are coming out of Idaho, and what I see replicated, certainly some, we're on the edge of some of these cruel practices. If you're hunting pups, if you're gunning down animals and you're not even pretending that it's sport, but even more than kind of the practices is just the anger, right? And that doesn't really have a whole lot to do with wolves, and I don't think it has a whole lot to do with livestock depredation. I think it has to do with the federal government, and this is, like I was saying before, it's a new context, but you can also see continuity, and that continuity is that wolves were often dragged into conflicts that weren't really about them, right? They become a symbol of, a political symbol. And we seem to be in an era where outrage draws attention and can get you votes and political power. And I think that these animals, really unfairly to them, they bring that out. So you could see how if you're a politician from a certain perspective and you want to score points as someone who is ultra conservative or upsets another group of people, wolves could be an avenue to do that. And that's a really old move in American history. And it leads down a road, which is, if you read my book and you look at some of the images at the end, that's where this leads. If you keep walking down this path, which is just extreme cruelty for no, utilitarian or pragmatic reason. It's like humans being vicious to one another.
I wonder in your research and from your opinion as a professor and as a teacher and as someone who is expelling all this knowledge, why do you believe, or what's something you can, because I've asked this question a bunch of times, why is it that this particular species, this particular animal is like you said, thrust in the middle of all of the things that is wrong or that eats at humankind? And and I'm not saying any animal should be in between the things that get in between what's wrong with us as humans, or that we have any sort of differences of opinion. But you just stated beautifully before, and rightfully so, this is the thing. This is the species and the animal that we automatically go to if we want to score points. If we want to get at somebody one way or the other, be it good or bad, in whatever way we think it is, this is the one we go right to. Why do you think that is?
Well, I mean, as a historian, I would offer up history, in an extremely long relationship with this animal, and kind of how I end the book is almost. There are biologists out there that know so much more about wolves than I do. I wrote this book a long time ago, and in some ways, it kind of grieves me that we're still talking about the cruelty that was displayed there, but that has been displayed in history. But I end the book thinking about, well, maybe one of the reasons to live with wolves is because we've got this history with them, right? There are species that this country has moved through time with, and I think it would say something about us as a country if we could learn to live with. Right? It's not a great history. It's not a happy history. But we'll hold out hope that it could have a different ending. And I think that would be to our credit if that could happen.
I love that sentiment. Being you're a born and bred Coloradan, I think that's how you say it. What is your if I butchered it, I apologize, Jon. When you heard about yeah, they did okay. When you heard about the prop that was going to reintroduce wolves on the Western Slope in Colorado, what was your initial feeling on that? And do you talk with friends or family? I don't know if anybody lives in Colorado still. What's the feeling that you get both personally and from anyone that you know who still lives there about what's going on in Colorado that would hopefully will have a good reintroduction in 2023?
Well, unfortunately, I mean, I still have some family that live there, but I haven't talked to them about wolves, and COVID put a strain on all of our ties, and I haven't been back to Colorado in a long time. So I actually had to do, when I saw that question, I had to go back and do some really terrible internet research and learn about the prop. I had been in a couple meetings a number of years ago talking about reintroduction and with different groups of people. Yeah, I mean, I think that the vote really symbolizes kind of where we're at. It's a very close vote. I'm happy that the reintroduction was voted for. I think that you see that there's going to be a road of hopefully people can talk to one another and be sensible and kind of resist the urge to needlessly politicize the animals themselves. And I would just urge people A lot of these last wolves came from Western Colorado. Reading about Bigfoot and Three Toes and Uniweek, might remind people that in not a distant past. This is not long ago that wolves were there. We're talking about the 1920s and the 1930s, and that was their home. It's reintroduction feels like, oh, we're reintroducing this alien species, but that's not true. It's their home, I know that these things can be very difficult, but I think that Colorado might be a place with a political environment which you could pull.
Yeah, we're looking forward to that. Before we let you go, I have my last question, but I also want to plug. I want everybody to know where they can find your book. My last question for you is: when you hear the word wolf, what is the thing that comes to your mind?
Well, for me, I've only met wolves in the archive, and I don't want to downplay that because it's pretty fascinating to see these records of these animals that animals don't leave documents. They don't have archives. So it's often hard to find traces of them in the past. For me, it really comes down to wolf bounty certificates. I did a lot of research with these little slips of paper, which are very depressing in their own way. But just to find any record of an animal in the past is remarkable. So yeah, I would say that they haunt our archives as well as a few of our landscapes today.
That is a very different answer than we've gotten.
Awesome.
And it's welcomed. So I appreciate that. So Jon, please tell everybody not only where can they find Vicious, but where can they find your other two books, Here Lies Hugh Glass and Nature Shock.
Well, Nature Shock and Vicious came out from Yale University Press, so you can get them from their website. They're on Amazon, floating around a lot of different places. So it shouldn't be too hard to find. I hope. And I have a website, Jon T. Coleman .com. People want to see the book covers or see some of the other writers.
Awesome.
Yeah. I'm not done with it, but I can tell all of you who are listening, I highly recommend it. It's a really in-depth portrayal of our history. And I think it's a perspective that anybody who's out there who wants to know the historical, the educational angle, to me, it's a must read. And I thank Mark Cook for pointing me to the book and therefore pointing me to you. Jon, this was an incredible conversation. Thank you again for really helping me learn more about just our history and the history of wolves and how hopefully we don't repeat what we did in our early years, and we can sort of learn from that. So I thank you so much for your book and for all your professional and teaching background that you're doing right now. So thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you.
It's a pleasure. So guys, go find those books on Amazon and read them up. So howls to all of you out there, and Steve and I will be with you next time. Bye, everybody.
Bye-bye.
Looking to support Wolf Connection or sponsor one of the wolves in our pack? Just go to wolfconnection.org, click on the donate tab, and find out more information.